Anushka, good to go now.
Okay, thank you. So namaste and good afternoon to everyone. Think India is a leading youth organization of the country which binds together the students of primary and national institutes to fulfill its aim of national reconstruction and nation building. IR Forum of Think India strives towards leading public discourse in international relations with an Indic and civilizational perspective and fostering the growth of independent thinking in young minds. So, our today's guest, Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, professor and dean at Jindal School of International Affairs, is a leading opinion columnist for India, for Indian newspapers like the Economic Times, the Asian Age, Express, and a popular commentator on international and current television issues on television. And he has authored several books on the subjects of international affairs. So thank you so much for giving us your time, Professor Chaulia. Professor, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Anushka. Namaste to everyone. It's so good to be back with Think India, which is, I know, very important nationalistic platform for thinking about domestic and international affairs. So I've been associated with Think India for many years now, and have addressed many of their gatherings. And I find that if at all there is a cluster of highly idealistic young people in this country who care about public issues, this is the one. So I'm very, very happy to be with Think India, and I believe that you are all the future. Uh, the title of today's talk is about the future of a very important country. Uh, and it's been in the news, all of you are following it. So I assume that most of you know the basic details of what's going on and why this is such a matter of high relevance for the contemporary international order. And of course, for India, it matters a lot, and we are heavily involved in trying to steer the outcome of this long conflict in one of our neighboring countries in a direction that serves India's national interest, but also is good for the region and for the world. So let me begin by talking briefly about the past before we go to the future. The past is very important, and in many ways, people have forgotten the past or are only looking at it selectively. So that's a very critical element to be able to assess the future. So, what was the past of Afghanistan? Hmm? And some of going back to ancient times, um, when the Mauryan Empire was at its peak, 4th century BC. Most of what we today call Afghanistan was part of the Mauryan Empire. So from Pataliputra, which is today Patna in Bihar, the empire went all the way up to the edges of what is today Iran, and it encompassed almost entire what we today call Afghanistan, right? So there was a time when there were large centralized empires and that could control this entire region, but that was in ancient history. But if you come closer to modern times, you find that the modern Afghan state was only uh, brought together through warfare and through alliances of various tribes only in the late 18th and early 19th century. And Ahmad Shah Durrani, who many in India know as Ahmad Shah Abdali, was one of the early conquerors who could bring together all the various tribes and clans and ethnic groups in this region under a unified Afghan state. But there hasn't been a very long or durable history of a unified or a centralized Afghan state. So I'm saying this out at the outset because people have exaggerated expectations about what kind of a polity Afghanistan should have, without understanding that the past has not been so great either, or so encouraging either. So the quest for a centralized Afghan state after the Durrani rule more or less fizzled out. It lasted just for a few decades. By early 19th century, you had Barakzai and other empires that replaced the Duranis, but none of them could really control the full territorial extent of what we today know as Afghanistan, right? And the Afghan state has been historically weak, has been decentralized. There is a notion of an Afghan national identity, but it's somewhat diffuse and it often gets overridden by other ethnic, tribal, or religious identities and loyalties. So by early 19th century itself, you had a pretty fragmented Afghan state, and the central dynasties were not necessarily in a position to control the whole populace as much as they would have wanted to. And foreign interference, that's the other big factor of the history of Afghanistan. Decentralized state, or sometimes non-existent or fragmented state, but also Waterloo for foreign invaders. These people often talk about Afghanistan as a graveyard for foreign imperialists. The first to try were, of course, the British, 1830s, 1840s, and they burnt their fingers. Then the Soviet Russia tried from 1979 onwards for about 10 years, burnt the fingers, and now the latest to do it is the United States, which of course has been there for almost 20 years and is now almost totally gone in terms of withdrawal. So if you look at the history, even though the Afghans are what we call today the modern day, what we call Afghans, that region, Khorasan, it used to have different names. Hardly anyone could control it internally, and definitely the foreigners tried to try and occupy it for strategic reasons and to control it for geopolitical domination, and they also failed. If you go back again in history, probably only the Sikhs under Maharaja Ranjit Singh and his successors, to some extent, had moderate success in defeating Afghan rulers and tribesmen and controlling some parts of what is today Afghanistan. But otherwise, it's been pretty much a story of a much coveted land, but which is not easily amenable for any single outside or even internal empire builder to bring together and to create some order. So this is the history of Afghanistan. There is, in fact, you go back to the genesis of the current impasse. Um, it starts with a Taliban rule from 1996 to 2001, uh, but which was overthrown through U.S. intervention. But even when Taliban were in power, they were not necessarily controlling the whole country. From 1996 to 2001, there was a lot of resistance and opposition to the Taliban. So what I'm trying to say is, before we think about the future, it's good to know about the political formations in this region and in this country of the past. And if the past, if it's like, are we going back to the future? That's a question that all of us need to think about. When we back to the future, meaning decentralized, federalized, or a relatively weak state, that has been the norm historically. Why has this been the norm? I mean, that's a bigger question. It's a historical question that we need to all think about. But certainly, the the if the past is a prelude to the future, then surely we should lower our expectations and not seek some kind of a really, really successful unitary state administered from Kabul and having complete control over its full territorial boundaries and over all the populations living in it. Now, coming to the present, um, there are, what are the trends right now? Warfare, of course, has been endemic for a long time, and in a way, the current cycle, you can say, started in 1979. So almost for the last 42 years, 43 years, the fighting has been going on in some form or the other, uninterrupted, involving foreigners, involving Afghans within the country, and also involving all the regional actors. So right now, what we are seeing is that the Afghan state, the government's, the central government's control is shrinking. There's no doubt about it. They are on the defensive and trying to hold on to major urban centers. And the Taliban, which of course was overthrown 2001 but has regrouped and rearmed, primarily with Pakistani support, uh, is advancing. And but there is a limit to how far the Taliban can advance, and the history, as I said, is the witness to those limitations. Um, and one of the reasons for the limitation is the presence or the prevalence of what are called warlords in different corners of the country, including even in the south, which is the Pashtun area, which is from where the Taliban originated with the Pakistani support. So Uzbeks, Tajiks, Hazaras, Turkmens, um, even Pashtuns, all of them have a long history of resistance to central government rule or central state or to the central state. So even though the Taliban is advancing, it's important to keep in mind that it's very unlikely that they can ever capture and control and govern the whole territory of Afghanistan. You hear in the media, some people are saying 53% of the districts are under Taliban control now. Some are saying 30%. There are different ways of measuring because it's a dynamic situation. The war is going on. The Taliban themselves are claiming 85%, which is actually totally fiction. But anyway, the important point I want to make is, given the historical background, it's important that we understand the complexity of this country in its fullness, and it's not a simplistic dual uh, contest between a central government and Taliban. There are many other forces. Sometimes they keep shifting their allegiances, and they have certain defined natural geographies which they control, and which they have been controlling for decades and even centuries. So there is a this gray area which is outside the government control, outside Taliban control, which is very important. Some people call it contested terrain, and that increasingly I think will be important. I'll come back to this when we talk about the regional powers. But there is this complexity. It's a multi-sided conflict, not yet a civil war, and I'll come back to that point also. It's a multi-sided conflict. It's not just a battle between a good but weak central government and a bad but strong Taliban. Right? That's the binary is too simplistic. Um, so, what are the likely outcomes of this latest scramble? Now that the US is withdrawn, they're tired, they've lost the will to continue to try and manage this country. President Joe Biden says, our job was never to do nation building. Our job was simply to eliminate Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. We achieved it. There's no reason to stay on. So, in other words, what he's saying is 2011, bin Laden was killed in Pakistan. And that was pretty much, that should have been the end of the war. There was no need to extend by another 10 more years. That's the US perspective. And it is because of, exhaustion. They're all exhausted. And 20 years, they haven't actually achieved much. And like I said, this Waterloo or graveyard of empires has not been very kind to the Americans either. So, so what are the likely outcomes now that the US is out of the picture? It's not going to be a central um, uh, arbiter of Afghanistan's destiny anymore. So what are the outcomes that the region, the countries around Afghanistan are staring at? The one, of course, the one that I already mentioned is civil war. Civil war has happened before many times in Afghan history, most recent in 1991 to 1996. At that time, there were two clusters of warlords. One was called Jamaat-e-Islami, the other was Hizb-e-Islami, and one was led by Ahmad Shah Massoud, the other by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And they fought and fought endlessly for 5 years. And the destruction was really, really terrible, including in big urban centers like Kandahar, Kabul, Mazar Sharif. And now the the question is, are we going to return to the civil war like situation? It is already a multi-sided war, as I've said, But the difference between now and then, at least right now and then, is that the civil war was like there were no clear lines at all. I mean, it was like there were two factions of Mujahideen fighters, and they were trying to control the country, and the kind of and they subsumed many of these warlords were part of these Mujahideen coalitions at that time. So they were fighting among themselves. Tajiks were fighting with the Pashtun, Pashtun were fighting with Uzbek. Then within these ethnic groups also there were many rivalries. It was like a all-out war of all against others. That kind of thing. So comparable to say like Libya today. Where there are like so many factions, so many governments and parallel governments. You really don't. Or Somalia, those are good examples. Now, is Afghanistan going to become another Libya, another Somalia? That's the big question. Yeah. So, as far as the region is concerned, I think from the point of view of all the countries that are going to be affected, civil war is bad for all of us. Not just for us, but for the entire all the neighboring countries, because there's a spillover effect of this fighting along ethnic and sectarian lines, because neighboring countries also have ethnic kinfolk on this side inside Afghanistan. So civil war is possibly the worst outcome, and definitely from the point of view of Afghan people who have been suffering for endlessly from war and violence and displacement, civil war is the worst option. Yeah. So if so, what it must to prevent a repeat of 1996, when civil war was so bad that people said any kind of force that brings order is acceptable to us. That's what created the opening for Taliban to take over. Yeah, in 1996, and we don't want that, and I don't think anybody wants a civil war. Not even Pakistan would prefer a civil war, because it has spillover effects. Already it hosts millions of Afghan refugees in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and in Balochistan provinces of Pakistan. So if there is civil war, there are going to be more and more refugees fleeing the country and looking for asylum in neighboring countries, and that creates a dangerous destabilizing mix in the whole neighborhood. By the way, you would know that India has been hosting Afghan refugees for almost more than 4 decades now. People who got displaced during the anti-Soviet uprising and the jihad of the 1980s. And we still have Afghan refugees, long-term refugees. So civil war is something that's bad for the region and for the Afghan people. What is bad for many others in the region is the re-establishment of a Taliban emirate. In other words, so think about it as a step-by-step process. Civil war first, then again, if we see a repeat of 1991-96 total destruction, and then again possibly Taliban or a faction of it gaining control over Kabul and restoring order in a very brutal and repressive manner, a kind of a silence, a piece of the graveyard kind of thing. So Taliban emirate, or what they call Islamic emirate, is bad for most of the actors in the region, and we know it from the 1996 to 2001 period. And most of us would want to avoid that outcome also, except perhaps Pakistan, for the reasons that we've talked about. The intrinsic link between the Taliban and the Afghan state, and the Pakistani state apparatus is quite well known. And in fact, the only reason the Taliban have survived a superpower invasion and occupation for 20 years is because of Pakistani support. There's no other reason for them to be able to have withstood the NATO presence and the US military campaign for 20 years. So possibly the only state that will benefit from a emirate or re-establishment of an Islamic emirate under Taliban control will be Pakistan. But you see the spillover of is not only with refugees, into Pakistan, but also with the ethnic linkages on both sides of the Durand line. Many people on both sides, the Pashtuns, believe that it's an artificial line, and they don't accept the boundaries of Pakistan as was drawn up uh, by the British at the time of the partition of India. So a lot of the Afghan and the Pakistani Pashtuns are of the similar ethnic mix, and they don't accept the legitimacy of the international borders between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, in fact, there is a movement for Pashtunistan, or a broader Pashtun kingdom, or state that will include a large portion of Pakistan's northwest. So the Pakistanis, even though the intelligence and the military have wanted a kind of a bring back Taliban to power and have been actively supporting it, even now they are doing it in the guise of peace talks and all that. But basically, they want Taliban takeover. They, of course, are playing with fire because there is a so-called Pakistani Taliban. It's also sometimes known as TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. These are very close cousins of the Afghan Taliban, but they operate on this side of the Durand line in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, and to some extent in Gilgit-Baltistan, which is a Pakistani-occupied Kashmir. So these Pakistani Taliban are also watching, and some of them are also crossing the border and participating in the fighting that's going on. And sometimes they have differences with the Afghan Taliban, but in general terms, they are of a similar ideology and have the similar jihadist goals of establishing a broader Islamic emirate that includes parts of Pakistan. So the Pakistani Taliban are active, and they are not going to. If there is a Islamic emirate in Afghanistan, it will benefit the Pakistani Taliban too, and they will look to attach the regions, the tribal areas, and the northwestern part of Pakistan to the Islamic emirate, fully out of the control of the ISI and the military. So there is this spillover threat. Uh, you might ask, if it is such a grave threat, why is Pakistan still persisting in backing the Taliban? That is because the ISI and the military have vested interests in this whole war. They have generated a lot of wealth through narcotics, through drugs, and through weapons sales across the porous borders. So even if Pakistan is destroyed or engulfed in the flames or the spillover, these security agencies don't mind, because this is a kind of a country where you will go back in history. 1971, they knew that the country was on the verge of a breakup, and still they persisted with their policies because that's what they thought was necessary to hold the country together. So the military and the ISI establishment have often made wrong calls, fatally wrong calls that have led to disaster for Pakistan. And right now, if they are going to continue trying to finance and arm the Taliban in Afghanistan to try and take over the whole country, then there is this backlash that they should be ready for. Pakistan says that officially, since the TTP campaign started inside Pakistani territory, that they have lost 80,000 people. And they say that the military is fighting a war on terrorism within Pakistan. Now, you can imagine how much more the casualties are going to be if there is going to be a Taliban rule in Kabul. It's not going to be easy to control them. That's the point I'm trying to make. Because many people look at the Taliban Pakistan relationship as just a kind of a patron client relationship. But it's much more than that. In fact, it's a kind of an alliance. And often the Pakistanis fail to control all the leadership and the elements of Taliban. So that's the second option: civil war, Islamic Emirate. The third option is power sharing agreement, which is good for all. The talks that are going on in Qatar are on paper good for all. On paper, they're supposed to help create a framework by which there will be a sustainable ceasefire, end to the fighting and the violence, and it will lead to some kind of at least a stoppage to the daily killings and military campaigns on the ground. And this is what Afghan people want. Frankly, if you ask them, you support Taliban or you support Afghan government or you support your local warlord, it's less important for Afghan people who they support. What they want is just a stoppage to the fighting, right? So power sharing is in the best interest of Afghan people, is in the best interest of all the neighboring countries also, to avoid this spillover that I'm talking about. But how do we get to power sharing when the Taliban and the Pakistani backers think that they have got the advantage and are trying to drive home their advantage even as the peace talks are continuing in Qatar? This is, of course, the biggest issue. We in India, we've been saying we want power sharing, we want, or at least some kind of a negotiated settlement, not the peace of the graveyard. So, how do we get there? Negotiation. It has to involve regional powers. So, although many have intervened in Afghanistan in the past and have burnt their hands and fingers, the thing is, without regional involvement, we cannot reach this goal of a permanent ceasefire and an end to the war. And it's very important that regional powers think beyond narrow zero sum game nationalism. Zero sum game nationalism is my gain is my opponent's loss, right? And Afghanistan has suffered a lot due to that in the past. Um, Pakistanis say that Indians are getting too influential and we need to roll it back. Iranians think that, if the Taliban gets too strong or if they don't have some kind of influence on Taliban, then the Shias will be annihilated in Afghanistan, and Iran feels that they have to protect the Shia minorities in Afghanistan, Hazaras. So the what has happened is that in each country historically has invested in some local alliance within Afghanistan or partnership with the view to pushing back another rival country. In other words, Afghanistan became the battleground for settling geopolitical scores. And again, you go back in time, it's not new. Even 19th century, what was called the Great Game between the Russian, Tsarist Russia and Imperial Britain, Victorian Britain, they were also doing similar things to try and gain influence and to edge each other out. So, like Syria, you would have all followed the Syrian Civil War from 2011, the last 10 years. It's one of the worst conflicts that we've ever seen since World War II. And like Syria, all the neighboring countries have often approached the Afghanistan from a narrow zero-sum game mindset, and each have got the proxies in there, and each will look to support their respective proxies to to ward off the opposing countries. So it's that kind of like a theater or a kind of geopolitical football that different actors are playing, and the Afghan people have suffered a lot because of that. So instead of zero sum game narrow nationalism, what we need is a kind of a regionalism that is based on some uh, commonly understood goal or endpoint, and that should be power sharing and permanent ceasefire or settlement, negotiated settlement. Now, what are the options for regionalism, and how can regionalism work? There are two types of regionalism, right? One is what you call a multilateral or large group regionalism. The most obvious forums for this is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Almost all the countries that have got stakes in this conflict in this region are members of the SCO, and the SCO is the forum which actually has got a formal mandate to stabilize Afghanistan. All of them are there. Pakistan is there, Iran is there, Russia, China, India, all the Central Asian countries. Everybody is part of the SCO. And There are also other mechanisms, like Heart of Asia. That's another, forum that has been running for a long time to bring together all the major regional countries to form a consensus on how to go forward. The problem with the multilateral options is that China and Pakistan have often not seen eye to eye with the rest of the countries. And that's because China has often deferred to Pakistan on what should be done about Afghanistan. China actually has a direct border with Afghanistan. Very few people know it. There is this narrow strip of northeastern Afghanistan called the Wakhan Corridor in Badakhshan province. Wakhan Corridor directly has a border with Xinjiang, Chinese controlled East Turkestan, as the Uyghurs call it. So China has often relied on Pakistan and the Taliban to give it guarantees that there will be no spillover into Xinjiang. But now the big question is that guarantee going to? I mean, the Taliban are even now assuring China that they will not interfere in the internal affairs of China, and that they will not promote jihadist violence in insurgency in Xinjiang. But I don't know if you've all been following the news closely. Just a few days ago, there was an attack on Chinese workers in Khyber province of Pakistan, which is close to the that region is called Kohistan, and it is on the Indus, right across the border with Afghanistan. And here, 9 Chinese workers have been killed. Is the biggest attack on Chinese workers in the region ever. So there is actually the threat to the Chinese is increasing from these jihadist groups, even though Taliban is assuring them, saying that we will not interfere and we will not harm you. And they want Chinese money and financing to be able to rebuild the country after some kind of settlement, or even if they manage to run over the whole place and establish an emirate. The problem for the Chinese is that relying on the guarantees and the assurances given by Pakistan is not proving to be very effective for them. They are very angry. If you see the subtext of what happened with this Dasu hydroelectric power project, which the Chinese were building with their financing, their engineers, their workers, they are very upset and angry with Pakistan, because Pakistan said we assure your full security, and they have put thousands of forces to protect Chinese workers and engineers and Chinese staff and their families who are operating inside Pakistan, but they are not safe. The attacks continue to grow. So the issue is that neither Pakistan nor Taliban are really fully going to be able to assure the Chinese of their safety. Uh, and because of what China is doing in Xinjiang, which is a very, very brutal kind of cultural genocide of the Uyghur Muslim minorities, there's a lot of anger against China among jihadists. So it's not, uh, it's very simplistic to think that if Taliban are dominant in Afghanistan, then Pakistan and China will reign supreme, and their influence will expand. That is what you hear a lot in India, commentaries saying that, oh, Taliban takeover is imminent and it will benefit Pakistan and China, and India will lose out. The point is, the kind of ideology and the narrow Islamist extremism that these forces represent is such that nobody, not even Pakistan, as I explained, or even China, can be sure that they will end up as the winners. Pakistan is not winning the war in Afghanistan, I can tell you that. China is not winning. Uh, and in fact, Chinese have been for a long time saying they will extend their Belt and Road initiative to Afghanistan and include and start building infrastructure there. So far, they have failed. Even Pakistan, like I said, their infrastructure projects are being met with jihadist resistance, and also locals oppose Chinese influence there. So so if there is some kind of a realization, especially in Beijing, that relying on Pakistan and Pakistani guarantee is a failed bet, then they will be more open to a broader multilateral agreement rather than narrow zero-sum game thinking. And that's where I think there is an opportunity, to turn around. And the recent attacks in Kohistan prove the point that China needs to rethink its approach to this region, to the what the Americans used to call AFPAC. Right? AFPAC is not hospitable or open to China, and it's getting more and more dangerous for them. So full multilateralism, we are all exploring options, trying to find a regional agreement. My view is that the region should declare through SCO and individually also that we will not recognize any Islamic Emirate if the Taliban try to establish or re-establish it through force. Last time in 1996, only 3 countries recognized the Islamic Emirate. This time, I don't think even Pakistan will dare to recognize an Islamic Emirate. Forget China. So, one way of applying pressure on the warring parties, especially the Taliban, on the ground is by declaring now itself that we will never recognize or accord any international legitimacy to any kind of a state or a mini state that they will carve out through blood and through fighting. The second form of regional option is, of course, a plurilateral, meaning small group countries, like-minded countries coming together. One obvious triangle is India, Iran, and Russia. We have in the past backed some of these militias and ethnic warlords to try and counterbalance the Taliban. And India, Iran, Russia certainly are again in close coordination. You must have observed that earlier in July, Dr. Jaishankar, our foreign minister, visited Iran and then Russia, exactly with this coordination in mind. We are drawing up some contingency plans, which are not, I don't think, are being made public, but which are necessary. States have to think about worst case scenarios. The civil war or the Islamic Emirate, the two worst case scenarios that I've already outlined, are not acceptable to any of us. And then the question is, what happens to the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan up north? The Turkmen, Uzbek, and Tajik. All of them have got kinfolk inside Afghanistan, and they share a lot of ethnic and linguistic affinities with them. And the news about some of the border posts being taken over by Taliban, both on the Iranian side and on the Uzbek and the Tajik side, is quite disturbing in all these countries, because which means the Taliban are now controlling the entry and exit into their countries, and will now charge customs duties and border taxes, and effectively will also be able to destabilize these countries. So just like Xinjiang, for example, there is in Xinjiang, there was the East Turkestan Islamic movement that had training camps with Taliban, Al Qaeda, and even with ISIS in Afghanistan. Likewise, there is the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, IMU, another group that historically has had a lot of linkages with Taliban and Al Qaeda and even ISIS inside Afghanistan. So these terrorist groups will now be heavily emboldened. So it's these countries cannot afford to allow a civil war or a Islamic Emirate to happen. So they have to intervene. The question is, how will they intervene and in what combinations? Small groups, plurilateral combinations with which other countries? And I must mention here that intervention, earlier people were saying that, this is like a quagmire, or once you, it's like a trap. Once you get in, you cannot come out, and look how badly the Americans failed. But I think the thing is, the Americans failed because they had very grandiose ambitions. And it's so revealing that even now, 20 years later, George W. Bush, who the president at the time who had ordered the attack, the occupation and invasion of Afghanistan, even now, he continues to insist that it is a mistake to withdraw and the US should continue to remain in Afghanistan, because their belief was always that they had to militarily somehow subdue the place. Even though it has failed, he's still arguing in interviews now, former President George W. Bush, that this is a big mistake. Anyway, I mean, he's no longer in power, and a lot of things have changed, and the US public is no longer interested in, since Trump, they have become quite isolationist. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that there is a role for some of the, the US can still play a role, although it will not be the main player anymore, because they don't have forces on the ground anymore. But especially in supporting different elements, including the Afghan government forces through air power. Air power is becoming a big crisis, because the Afghan National Defense Forces are unable to hold terrain without air power. And Afghan Air Force is still, despite many years of training and a lot of funding from the NATO countries, is not able to really have the kind of advanced firepower and ability to beat back Taliban advances, or to defeat ISIS or any of the other groups that are now populating the whole terrain. So air power is an area where I think the region should come together and come up with a plan, uh, using some of the neighboring countries with the US Air Force, but also others being involved. And the more you look at the situation in Afghanistan, I'm quite convinced that while India does not need to put boots on the ground, it's just too risky and too unacceptable within the country also, because we have a lot of security issues now right now, matching the Chinese on the LAC. You would know that we have deployed 60, 70, or 80, or possibly more thousand troops to push back the Chinese from Eastern Ladakh and all across the western sector of the LAC. And we are ramping up our infrastructure. So frankly, we cannot afford to be involved in terms of the ground warfare in Afghanistan, and or even a peacekeeping force, as some are suggesting, on the ground. But what we can do is, I think, air support, and our Air Force, and especially with regard to training Afghan Air Force, and to equip them with sufficient missiles and bombs and strike abilities. This is very important now on the ground. So the regional intervention has to have a military dimension, because the the players on the ground are not playing nice. So it's not like the regional countries can only do diplomacy, and with diplomacy we can somehow uh, uh, you know solve this entire crisis. I think it's a misnomer, and this is where you need more defense diplomacy and coordination with neighboring countries. The belief that simply by talking and forming some consensus in Tashkent or in Moscow, we can somehow resolve this problem, I think is naive, because on the ground they are heavily armed actors in this multi-sided war. So we need to have a military dimension to the regional intervention, or regional cooperation. And my view is it should be um, premised on the basis of maintaining a balance of power and preventing Taliban from uh, becoming dominant across 60, 70, 80% of the terrain of the country, and ensuring that there is enough pressure on Taliban and their Pakistani backers to moderate, if not stop, their offensives, and to go to settle for something less than what they desire, which is the establishment of an Islamic Emirate. They have to settle for a lot less than this. So, and for that to happen, uh, only diplomatic engagement and coalition building and plurilateralism will not be enough. So there must be some level of ground forces from neighboring countries, especially Central Asian countries, and possibly Iran, which are directly affected by what is going on there, and backed up by other incentives like economic ones. So for reconstruction, rebuilding of the country, there have to be clear signals, like I said before, from the international community, from the regional powers about recognition, legitimacy, sanctions. All these things have to be clearly stated upfront. And as far as the Afghan people go, ultimately, like we all say, they have to decide, right? They have been rendered powerless through excess militarization and handover of almost all the decision making um, levers to armed actors. So there is a fragile but existing civil society in Afghanistan. There are women who don't want the slow gains of the last 20 years to just be lost and for them to again be stoned to death or for their arms to be chopped off in public squares. So that kind of extreme hardline jihadist state or emirate will not be acceptable, and people will fight for it. So that's why I'm saying fight, meaning they are looking for ways and means to be able to survive and hold their own without resorting to violence. There is a non-violent resistance to this, both to Taliban and to warlords and to other armed actors, but they have been weakened. So I think the regional power should also have a strong strategy to support these local actors who are trying to prevent extremist takeover and violent forms of solutions. So I'll conclude there by simply saying that the region's choice must be the option of permanent ceasefire, negotiated settlement, and some kind of power sharing, but power sharing which also involves civil society and women, not a power sharing based on whoever has the largest number of troops under his command. That warlord will get a ministry, or that warlord will get a share of the state, the new reformed Afghan state after any kind of settlement. So in other words, what I'm saying is that you need a mix of a realpolitik but also some kind of idealistic value based reconstruction, because if it is only power sharing, then it's like a might is right, and the biggest warlords, the Taliban, and will then continue to control and rule the whole country in a way that is quite savage. And by the way, I must just caution you all, just if there are anti-Taliban warlords, it doesn't mean that those are good guys. Just for your information, many of them have a history of being quite brutal with their own the populations that they control. So the decentralized state is natural and it's historic, as I've mentioned, but it should not lead to a situation where basic human values are crushed and there is no peace dividend. There will be no peace dividend if it is pure power sharing, or if it is a Islamic emirate, or if there is civil war. None of these options. So I'll stop there and I'll take questions. But the basic point I'm trying to make for all of you is to understand the complexities and to get a little bit into the history and the present of the conflict, and to rise above zero sum game considerations. Right now, it's not about maintaining our influence or for any other country to maintain influence there. Um, yes, we have invested a lot, more than $3 billion worth of um, development projects and infrastructure we have been building in Afghanistan. And we would want those to be preserved and not to be destroyed or lost in fighting or through vandalism of the victorious Taliban or their backers. Uh, so uh, there are a lot of sunk costs, to use an economic term, for many of the neighboring countries. And that's all the more reason why we are stakeholders. And we can't just abandon this country because it has huge ramifications and spillover effects that I've mentioned before. Um, we are India for India. Right now we are trying to stabilize the situation in Kashmir, since we have abrogated Article 370, and it's very important that we cut off all the potential supply lines for jihadists from Afghanistan across Pakistan up to Indian Kashmir. So it's very critical for us. The history shows that if Afghanistan is under an emirate or under civil war like conditions, then there will be ripple effects of it all the way up to Kashmir, and many armed actors will cross over and go and get trained and come back and cause mayhem in India. So I would say that military and security dimension is very critical. We have been doing a lot of economic assistance and development assistance in the past, but like I said before, there is no harm in stepping up one level and doing a kind of military support operations, especially for the Air Force, without ground forces, but for the Air Force, and maybe in the form of a joint command along with other interested countries, not just a single country's intervention. So no easy solutions. I try to present you the full complexity of the picture, and every country has national interests and will look for defending and advancing its national interests. But I don't think it's now quite clear. No single country, both in the past, the several centuries, and right now, no single country can really um, shape the destiny of Afghanistan. And those who have tried have failed. Americans are just the latest. So it's very important that we have some group based action and group based coordination, and there's no alternative to it. Otherwise, all the worst case scenarios that I've laid out will come true. Thank you. I'll take questions now.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your insights on such a complex country and topic. And I think it has really helped all of us to understand, the history of Afghanistan and how it is sort of reflecting in the future to come. So we actually have so many questions, and we also prepared some questions ourselves. So I'll just combine questions that are on similar topics. So the first is that what implications will Taliban dominated Afghanistan will have for India's soft power and influence in the region? And do you think that there is any nexus in place between Taliban and other stakeholders to counter India's soft power and goodwill in Afghanistan? And apart from that, do you think that with the increase of Taliban's presence in Afghanistan, should India consider to have a dialogue with them?
Okay, that's good. We are already having a back channel with the Taliban. There's no question about it. We have come out in the open also about it, and the elements that are not hardline and who don't view India through the prism of religious fundamentalism or jihadist hatred, those kind of elements, nationalistic Taliban who don't want to, get involved in Kashmir and all these faraway things, we are engaging with them and we'll continue to engage with them. Whether Indian goodwill will be lost? No, look, I was there a few years ago and I still remember in Kabul, in Mazar Sharif, um, be it the Pashtun or the Uzbek or Tajik or any of the major ethnic groups, ordinary people often view India with a lot of respect and liking, and that's simply because we are like the alternative to Pakistan, because Pakistan has become so heavily involved in the proxy war there, that and is seen as the main cause for the destruction and the weakening of the Afghan state. So a lot of people hold India in high regard across all the ethnic and regional dimensions. So I think if we are part of a regional initiative that helps to rebuild the country, we have already been involved in rebuilding. But frankly, sometimes the war has been so long there that some people used to call it post-conflict reconstruction. But frankly, the conflict never ended and the fighting has been going on. So the real post-conflict reconstruction can only begin after a settlement which is overseen and guaranteed by regional powers from outside, the power sharing and all those things that I mentioned. So we will continue to have goodwill there. Nobody can actually, for example, Taliban cannot force a change in the public opinion about India. Uh, Even in the regions they control, the heartland, Kandahar, Uruzgan, Helmand, and southern and eastern Afghanistan, which is the Taliban base, even there's tremendous support for India, among ordinary people, and respect for India. Our cultural exports are very popular. Our movies and our music industry, and people genuinely believe that we have done a lot of good work for them. You go to the Herat, to the westernmost part of Afghanistan, you find that when we built the Salma Dam, it's been a huge success for local farmers, for irrigation, for economic development. Even the Iranians appreciate what we have done on that side, towards which is closer to the Iranian border. So every region, India is seen. In fact, I think people also travel. A lot of Afghans come to India for tourism, for medical healthcare, and these kinds of things. As I told you before, there are long-term Afghan refugees still in India. So, and I think we have been engaged here in our university with training a lot of Afghan civil servants and Afghan teachers and lecturers, and building their capacities over the years. We've done some amazing projects for them. So I feel like that can never be taken away from us. In fact, it will only increase once there is a post-conflict, the transition to post-conflict Afghanistan. But the fighting, and I don't think the Afghans really want one more player to get involved in the fighting. They are not looking to India to put boots on the ground, and nobody, I've never heard that. But definitely, like I said, Air Force, aerial combat support, I think they will be grateful. A lot of people will be grateful if we are involved in it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor. The next question is that what do you think would be China's role in the post-US withdrawal Afghanistan? And in the similar context, do you think that the importance of CPEC will decline as there are recent attacks on the Chinese soldiers, and even before the Baloch have attacked some projects of CPEC? And do you think that that China would consider the geographical route from Afghanistan or Iran to access the Arabian Sea? Will this result into the decline of priority of Pakistan and China's foreign policy?
Well, that's all good, excellent questions. I'll only say that, see, theoretically, when one great power recedes or slips away, another great power will find an opportunity to try and take over or fill the vacuum. And to that extent, the Chinese have for a long time been not so, they have been critical of the US military presence in Afghanistan in the past. But now, when the actual military withdrawal is happening, the Chinese are saying it's a hasty. 20 years have passed. Even after 20 years now, the Chinese are saying it's hasty. The Americans should continue to be there. And one of the reasons, by the way, for that is the Biden administration is saying that they want to cut. In fact, it started with Trump, and Biden is also doing the same thing. They want to cut their losses in many of these regional conflicts and war theaters, Middle East, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and reorient their military to countering China in the Indo-Pacific. So in a way, it's in China's interest to keep the US preoccupied and still stuck in these quagmires like Afghanistan or Iraq, or Syria. So they would prefer that the US continue to be here. So in that sense, they're not thinking in terms of, now that the US is going, we can go and you know be the number one or boss around. Actually, they can't. Like these incidents I mentioned, and which the questioners are saying, the the the, the policies of China in Xinjiang are so brutal and so oppressive that if you are a jihadist, And if you have a very narrow vision and a belief that Islam is in danger everywhere in the world and I have to go and fight to defend Islam, then you will have to hate China. There's no two ways about it. Even Pakistan, because of its extreme dependence on China, refrains and avoids mentioning Xinjiang officially because they are so dependent on China and are bankrupt. But if you ask the Pakistani Taliban or the jihadis or even ordinary people in Pakistan, a lot of them have a lot of misgivings about what China is doing in Xinjiang. So I think the Chinese are not going to benefit from this in any big way. And the way in which China has expanded its influence around the world is by throwing money. The problem is that's not going to silence or buy the loyalty of Taliban or of other hardline jihadis. If the jihadis can be stopped through money, the world would have ended this menace long ago. You know, the jihadis, what is the psychology of the jihadis? Is not they are not looking to be, they cannot be bought off. Look at the ISIS mindset. There is a big ISIS problem in Afghanistan also. I didn't mention it. In many parts, especially eastern provinces bordering Pakistan, like Nangarhar. It's now almost 10 years since, 8 to 9 years since ISIS has been operating there and are attacking Shias and attacking other religious minorities. Um, and what is their mindset? They are not amenable to any kind of negotiation. You can't say, I'll give you $1 million and you stop the killing. That's not going to work. They'll say, you give me the $1 million and I'll use it to kill more enemies of Islam. So what I'm saying is they are so hardline, they're not rational, quote unquote, in a normal sense. So Chinese power cannot succeed in this kind of environment. I don't see them being able to buy off all these jihadist groups. They can bribe the Taliban, which they seem to be doing already and seem to be offering them economic incentives. But there are many other hardline groups that they cannot control through their usual commercial or checkbook diplomacy or projects or infrastructure building. That will not be enough. They have to change their policies in Xinjiang. They have to actually, many people, the jihadis believe that Xinjiang is the last frontier for freedom struggle, and they have to fight for freedom from China, from Chinese colonialism. So, and the because of the non-stop focus of the Western media on what is happening in Xinjiang and the cultural genocide by China, is not going to work in China's favor. So China, I think, like I said, they should lower their um, hopes of being able to dominate this region through Belt and Road, and they should actually rethink their basic strategy and should come together with under SCO with other countries and try to come up with a regional coordinating committee or mechanism through which Afghanistan, the war can be stopped in Afghanistan. So I think that's yeah. China cannot really. I don't see China as benefiting from any of the scenarios that I laid out. The end points. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Like you already mentioned about the SCO, so the next question is related to that. That to what extent does the SCO serve India's interest? And apart from that, only today there was a news in Times of India that recently the US, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan have agreed to form a new quadrilateral diplomatic platform, which was termed as Quad, focused on enhancing regional connectivity. So, what are your views on this seemingly new term in IR?
Okay, very good. SCO is very important for us. If we were not part of SCO as a full member, we would not be able to internally counterbalance Chinese hegemony. So, because we are part, Russians wanted us in SCO, and they had been lobbying to bring us into SCO for a long time. Then the Chinese said, if India can come in, then why not Pakistan? So Pakistan has also been made a full member of SCO. Both are now full members, but that's okay. We do need See, Asia, there are a lot of geopolitical fault lines and this narrow zero sum game nationalism that I spoke about, rivalries. So it's good to have regional or sub regional institutions that can mitigate some of the worst consequences of this narrow nationalism. So SCO is an important forum. In fact, I see that that is the only means, existing formal institution through which we can find a regional solution to Afghanistan. There's no other such organization or body or formal institution through which we can find solutions. Um, and in a way, one would hope that process I'm talking about of getting China to move away from blindly backing Pakistan on Afghanistan, I see SCO as one of the uh, means through which China can be, if China Pakistan axis is geopolitical to contain India, but that will remain. But what I'm saying is blindly following the Pakistani assurances and guarantees, and giving the benefit of doubt to Pakistan, I think that will not work for China and for its interests. So SCO is the only means by which that process can take. Of course, Pakistan is a member there, but it's isolated. None of the other, really frankly, Pakistan doesn't have an ability to rally all the SCO members to follow its line of thinking, which is that Taliban is a good player, no? And the Taliban must be enabled and strengthened. I don't think anyone is buying that. So India's interests in what was the question, Anushka? India's interest, the second one.
Professor, the second question is actually a very new kind of thing that today's Times of India reported.
Ah,
So it is basically sort of a new quad initiated
fair
by
enough.
UN.
Yeah, so there
Yes.
are all kinds of such, formations being announced from time to time. I don't think we should take it too seriously. It doesn't mean that somehow Pakistan is now succeeding with Central Asian countries. Uh, Uzbekistan, there's a direct border between Balkh province of northern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. I've been up to there. There used to be a trade railway across from after Mazar Sharif and up to the Uzbek border. They see the Central Asian countries are very important because they can ultimately solve the landlocked problem of Afghanistan. You know, because Afghanistan is landlocked, it does not have access to the ocean. There is for the only future for Afghanistan that you can think as a viable state is as a transit between or as a what they call a bridge between Central Asia and South Asia for trade and collecting the transit fees passing through Afghanistan, both ways. No, so that kind of future is only possible if the Central Asian countries are able to stabilize Afghanistan. They've got gas, they've got oil, they want to sell to the Indian subcontinent. Right now, we are using the Chabahar and through the oceanic side. But ultimately, the hope is that we can use land as well, although Pakistan is an obstacle to that. So, um, uh, Uzbekistan will want no spillover, like I said, and they will want any agreement that can help to try to achieve their goals. So I don't think we should read too much into these groupings. Turkey, sometimes people talk about Turkey being a player because they control or they have been providing security to the Kabul airport, and that is crucial for the presence of the diplomats, because if there is no international force guarding the Hamid Karzai International Airport, which is also a military base, then the international community will be completely cut off from Afghanistan. So Turkey is also a kind of a player and has been negotiating with NATO to maintain its presence in the Kabul airport. So there are other players. I mean, if you think about it, more can be discussed in terms of a broader regional set of players. Iran's role also, I've not had the chance to cover it fully. Iran is a big player, it's a direct neighbor of Afghanistan. So they are there. But I think, and all of them continue to have meetings. You see, it's like a scramble kind of situation right now. While the fighting is going on the ground, everybody is in a state of panic and trying to meet and coordinate with every second player. in some form or the other. Try to get some basic guarantees that will at least secure their core interests, if not the maximal interests.
Thank you, Professor. So there are just two more questions that I'll take. So the first one is related to the two possibilities of Afghanistan's future that you mentioned in the beginning of the lecture. So, if a civil war or the possibility of a dominant Islamic state takes place in Afghanistan, what is going to be the future of the Afghan civilian government?
Well, Trump started this whole thing about downplaying the value and significance of the Afghan government. In fact, Trump never even consulted with them, and he automatically announced that May 1st, 2022, all US troops will leave the country. He didn't even bother to consult Ashraf Ghani's government. And the legitimacy of Ashraf Ghani is also almost zero now, because he got re-elected very controversially with very small turnout. Not even 20% of the voters cast their ballots. So the Afghan state, frankly, cannot expect to exist the way it has existed as long as there was a US umbrella to protect it. Now that umbrella is gone. So the Afghan state uh, there was a lot of issue with governance and with corruption and with inability to control the warlords in different provinces. Um, so Ashraf Ghani tried to run it like a very centralized model, with a presidential system and all, and he failed. So now I don't see much future for them, except that they do have some capable commandos and special forces under their control still. So they will be like one out of maybe seven, eight, or nine um, players that will control different parts of the country. Big cities, I think they will still control Afghan state, but countryside and the provinces, a lot of the more distant provinces, they will not be able to. So it's like a rump state, a state that has shrunk in its abilities and its capacity. And it will have, if there is a power sharing, then and a deal, that's the ideal thing, because then some of these notables like Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani and others can continue to have some kind of a say in what happens to the country. If it is civil war, then they'll become more and more marginalized, because uh, whenever there's civil war, the other forces like warlords and Taliban, they will have an upper hand. If it's an emirate, I don't think it's going to happen, for the reasons that I mentioned. There are limits to Taliban takeover. But let us assume if it becomes an emirate again, then they are going to be evacuated before it happens to save their lives. They all have to evacuate. They may have to seek asylum in India or in Iran or Russia or maybe the US, and escape before they could be potentially be assassinated or killed. So I don't think it's going to reach that point, because of the factors that I've mentioned. And history sometimes repeats itself, but also it takes new turns. So we should be open to. I've 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 talked a lot about the historical structural factors in this conflict and in this region of the world, but they can also alter with time. So it's a big, I think, litmus test for regionalism. And everybody says regional solution, regional solution, regional solution, regional end game. We have been saying this for almost 10 years now. It's not a new thing. But as long as there was US presence, all these countries sat back and said, never mind, last resort, the US presence, somehow they will hold the fort. Now that it's gone, the region has no excuses for inaction. So um, I think, and as I said before, it is not in any single country's hands to mold the destiny of Afghanistan. So it has to be a collective effort. This is the ultimate test of multilateralism or plurilateralism.
Thank you so much, Professor. So I think we have already run out of time, and there are actually many questions that I will have to miss for now. But we can maybe send these questions in a Word document, or maybe you can address them in some future, talk about this similar topic. So I really want to thank you for your time and for being here. And personally, it was an honor for me to host you because I'm myself a student of JSIA. So I was really happy about hosting you, and it's always intellectually stimulating to read your articles and to even listen to you in classes and here. So thank you so much for your time because I know that you have a very busy schedule. So Shubham, would you like to say anything?
On behalf of Think India, I pay my sincere gratitude to Sir, who always accepts our request on very short notices and address us. Indeed, it was a pleasure for all of us to have a completely new understanding of the issue and nuances of the current topic from an erudite expert of international relations like Sir. We see forward for many more sessions in future. Thanks a lot, Sir.
Thank you. I want my request to all of the Think India youth is that the future of our country and of the region and of Afghanistan is in our hands, collectively. And my request to all of you is to reach out to student organizations in Central Asia, in Iran, even in Pakistan, across the region, and to build a regional coalition of young people who can form a voice and a platform, especially to support civil society and women of Afghanistan, and to ensure that the past does not repeat. Hmm? So it's in our hands, and I know Think India, ABVP have historically had strong links with student organizations in neighboring countries. This is the time to activate and to expand the discourse now. We can't just be thinking as India alone, because, as I said, no single country can really solve this puzzle. So I hope that Think India can find a way to create a broader forum for stabilization of Afghanistan, which is at the track 2 level or track 3, whatever we want to call it. While the diplomats and the governments and the militaries are all racking their brains on how to find a way out, we must also come up with a common position among the youth. The future of the youth, Afghanistan, what the average age of the country is, like hardly 20 years, I think. Is not even India, we say, is a young country. Afghanistan is even younger, but a lot of people have no hope at all. So let us engage with student groups in Afghanistan and in all the neighboring countries and create something which will be a voice that has to be heard by the armed actors or by the diplomats or by the government actors. So I hope that you will take this up as a task.
Thank you so much for suggesting this, sir. We'll surely strive towards building the same network, and we'll get back sometime in future.
Yeah, create something like a youth for a peaceful Afghanistan or something like that, no? And let us all come together and advocate strongly with clear vision of what we intend to achieve. Yeah. So always I look forward to Think India for that.
Sure, sir. We also look forward to you.
Thank you so
Uh,
much.
I'm thankful to the participants as well who took out time from their busy schedules and had the session. Thanks, everyone. Let's end this.
Thank you. Stay safe.